Hi, journeyers. My name is Tony Carnes, your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Today we have a special treat. We're broadcasting from Rome. You see St. Peter's Basilica in the background. And today we're going to interview a former New Yorker who is having a big impact on journalism. Stay tuned. Hi, journeyers. Welcome to A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Today we have a very special guest, the Reverend Professor John Mauck from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, Italy. Now, what's special? There are many important and special things about Professor Mauck. One, he's been here for 29 years, so he's seen a lot. He's been a priest for 25 years. And what we discovered is that he he teaches to journalists, and he runs a special journalist program in Rome that familiarizes journalists with the Vatican. But what I noticed is that one of his specialties is analyzing how different types of rhetoric has effects on audiences. So I thought this might be a good way to have him go through his life, and we'll talk about what he's discovered all the way from childhood through today, about what kind of rhetoric or communication style he used, and what effect it did, and what it taught him about what he needed. Now, you grew up in Chicago, is that right?
I was born in Chicago, just outside of Chicago, Park Ridge, Illinois. I'm the youngest of a large Catholic family, the youngest of 8 children. My father was a psychologist. He was a professor at Loyola University in Chicago. So I received an education, at school, but also at home from my dad.
And so you were a believing Catholic at that time?
Yeah, the whole family are all believing Catholics. Yeah, and I went to a Catholic grade school and high school.
So when you got...
I was always a believer, as far as I can recall.
Oh, I see. So when you got to high school is one of the big places where people try out different rhetorical styles. What would you say your rhetorical style was in high school?
Well, in terms of rhetoric in high school, probably I was most interested in the theater. I did a lot of acting in high school. I remember playing Brutus in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and Everyman in the medieval morality play Everyman, and also Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons. So I was always deeply interested in theater.
It sounds like you're always deeply in trouble in these dramas.
No, those are all people who have great difficulties in life. But no, I thought I think I was going to try to write plays or screenplays when I grew up. That was one of my dreams, but I never actually did that.
Now, so you grew up, evidently did pretty well in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a smart student, did you talk smart, or?
I don't know. I probably this probably has more to do with the kind of family that you grew up in, because I was the youngest of 8 in a fairly intellectual family. So I probably was precocious in the way I spoke. I mean, I probably spoke more like my older brothers and sisters or my parents, which would mean I was sort of adopting a rhetorical style that was beyond my years.
Oh, I see.
My suspicion. I don't remember, to be honest.
And now, you were admitted into Harvard.
When I was 16, yeah.
And so you went to Harvard?
Yeah.
And did your rhetorical style change?
No, it's an interesting thing about Harvard, I think, is Harvard I don't think requires you to be rhetorically gifted. I think what was important was that, as I say, I was a believer, and as a Catholic at Harvard, surrounded by people who frequently were non-believers, I think the important thing was that you had a sense of who you are, right? And were able to explain what you thought and why, right? And a sort of a straight-ahead, explanation of even, Roman Catholicism was acceptable, at least at that time. This would be the early 1980s right. At Harvard. For Americans, for Americans, the point of reference would be Conan O'Brien. So Conan O'Brien is a classmate of mine.
Oh, really?
That we'd be the same age. Yeah.
So did you pick up some of his rhetoric?
No, Conan was one of the funniest people, obviously, at the university, and he was already famously funny.
And so did your faith grow at Harvard, or it stayed the same, or?
I don't know that I would say my faith grew at Harvard. Certainly it was challenged. So one of the things that I think you become accustomed to at a place like Harvard, and certainly then later on I was going to work in Manhattan and also in Washington, D.C., and you become accustomed to explaining yourself to people who don't share your views. It's a very different experience from what I've been living for the last 30 years in Rome, working in a Pontifical university where everyone more or less is on the same page. So in high school, at a Catholic high school, and here in Rome, I'm surrounded by Catholics. But at Harvard and Manhattan and Washington, D.C., it was somewhat the opposite. I was surrounded by people who didn't believe. Sometimes they're curious, right, about the faith. Probably the closest experience I had to that in the last 30 years was I worked as a consultant on a film for 3 months in Argentina, a major motion picture directed by Roland Joffé, who made The Mission and The Killing Fields. And I was one of the few Catholics on the set, but because one of the main characters was a Catholic priest, I was there the whole time, and the people around, who I was working with and interacting with, were not at all Catholic believers, and Roland Joffé is not a believer either, the director who also wrote the script of the movie. So that was a little bit like going back to college, going back to the Harvard experience of explaining one's faith to people who are curious but not believing.
Well, I'm curious. You went from Harvard. You went through New York at a certain point.
Yeah, the late 1980s, I was working in Manhattan.
What were you doing there? Or?
I was writing. I've been a writer all my life. Right, I wrote freelance and also for the Human Life Review and Catholic Eye and the New Criterion. Various publications. So
it sounds to me like that, particularly since you mentioned the New Criterion, that you were leaning toward a literary style.
I definitely had. Later on in life, I wrote political speeches, but when I was in college and after college, I wasn't particularly interested in politics as such. That came a little later. Well,
I'm curious about your speech writing, which you did for centered in Pennsylvania for the governor then Senator Robert Casey.
Well, he was always governor. His son is now the senator.
That's right.
But his father was the two-term governor, and before that I wrote speeches for the Attorney General of the United States. It was William Barr, the first time that William Barr was the Attorney General, when he was very young, as I was quite young as well.
Well, I have two questions. It's natural out of this, but one, I'd like to go, when you write for a speechwriter, and particularly you're writing for a politician,
right.
You sometimes, in politics, the big challenge of rhetoric is keeping it authentic.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're constantly challenged to agree with people, or at least to be agreeable when you don't agree. And that sometimes it can feel like you're sort of being deceptive or you're emptying yourself out of content. Did you experience any, that being a writer in politics, that you sort of think, oh, I'm sort of false to myself or something like that?
I didn't have that experience. Probably it's in part because both William Barr and Bob Casey were Roman Catholics, so we shared a lot in common. I remember Casey asking me, you've been writing for Bill Barr, he's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, are we going to have problems? And I said, listen, I save my dogmas for religion, not for politics. And we got along very well. I got along with both of those men. And they were quite literary themselves. They were very well educated,
That's true.
Both of them. And so we had a sort of sharing that perhaps in some cases is not the typical thing, right? For a speechwriter and the person that he's writing for, they might be coming from very different worlds. But in my case, with Bill Barr and Bob Casey, we were on the same page as as far as I recall. I don't ever recall having major differences with either of them.
Well, did you have to write campaign speeches?
I didn't, because of course Bill Barr, being the Attorney General, didn't have to do any campaigning, and Casey, I worked for him in his second term, and he couldn't run again, so there was no campaign at that.
So maybe you didn't face that ethical dilemma of
No.
where the candidate has to
make promises that you can't keep and things like that.
Well, but and all this time, how was your Catholic faith progressing?
Well, I had joined Opus Dei, right? I'm a priest of the prelature of Opus Dei when I was in high school.
Oh, really? High school?
So I had already decided, for instance, to live celibacy when I was in high school. Long before I was a priest, I was living a celibate life. So in that sense, my faith was already quite strong and intense, I would say. Yeah.
What kind of rhetoric came out of that? I mean, what was your style when you talked about your faith?
I don't think that I.
If you had to say, this is the poetics of the early walk, what would you say?
Well, it's interesting. The rhetoric of Opus Dei, I would say, because Opus Dei is about the sanctification of ordinary life, right? And that everything that we do can be holy, right? And I think a distinctive thing about the rhetoric of people in Opus Dei is talking about their faith in, I would say, ordinary language. In other words, in ordinary tones. And in other words, we don't turn on a sort of religious tonality or religious rhetoric when we start talking about God. We can talk about God as we talk about the rest of life, because God and the rest of life are not separate. And so the ideal of Opus Dei is that there's a kind of unity of life. And I would say that actually plays into the rhetoric. Now, there's the unity of rhetoric when one talks about so-called religious matters, and when someone talks about professional or personal matters. It's the same tone, it's the same person, it's the same me speaking. I don't change registers in order to talk about God.
Well, that leads me to come up to what you're doing now. For some time, teaching communications, literature and communications, how to do journalism, or teaching journalists how to cover the Catholic Church.
Right.
That sort of hints to me that your reporting strategy, that, if I could call it that you teach, is just talk about the Catholic Church like you would just talk about normal life. Is that right?
I would aim for, in terms of rhetoric, a kind of naturalness. I would think of it as, speak naturally about what you know, right? In the religious context as well as in professional or context. Don't try and search for effects that are sort of rhetorical, fancy effects. But speak naturally and sincerely, and describe what actually you feel. Right? If one is enthusiastic, you can be enthusiastic. But if you're not, don't try and put it on. Right?
Well, I have a question in that regard. You contrast Pope Francis's rhetorical style with Pope Benedict's, and that they're two different. You're sort of kind to both of them, but you see it's two different styles, and that Francis' style helped him with the press, while Benedict's style undermined him. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And if you found a reporter that was, let's say, the Benedict's direction, what advice would you give?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I would say that it was the style of Benedict that would undermine him with some journalists, at least. I mean, sometimes it's a question of content. I think but my take on the rhetorical style of, say, Francis versus Benedict would be that Benedict was less interested in presenting himself. In other words, he was a professor, and he was about getting ideas across. And if he were able to, say, put his remarks in an envelope and hand them to the journalist or whoever he was talking to, and drop out of the picture himself, he would have been happy to do that. Whereas I think Pope Francis is much more personally engaged, right? And as we were hearing today, someone was saying that whenever Pope Francis makes a point, he usually brings up his own personal experience as part of the witness to that. And that's often very engaging. I think it's engaging for the listener, as opposed to the more professorial style of delivering information that Pope Benedict tended naturally to do, that he was about getting across a truth and dropping out of the picture himself, right? And I think there's a virtue in both of those approaches.
But you do say in a speech you gave to a group that the conversational style you have, the rhetorical style, has impact. It causes things to happen. And that Francis' personal style caused things to happen in the press because they felt approachable. Maybe they felt like he was one of them or something. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But while Benedict, who was honest and humble to take his personality out, the consequences were that they caused a negative spear or a reaction to come up around him, maybe unjustified.
To some people, obviously, I think there's a distance, right, from Pope Benedict that perhaps there wasn't as much distance with Pope Francis, and with distance between him and his interlocutor, right, because of the less personal engagement. But at the same time, I think Pope Benedict's an extremely effective communicator, and in my experience at least, I know more people who have sort of come back to the faith because of Benedict's writing, right? They've had time to sit and read his writings, then have come to the faith because of Pope Francis, even though they might find Francis more appealing, right? In the end, the actual conversion or transformation has been more effective through the less ostensibly attractive method of Pope Benedict. It's kind of a curious thing. I also think one thing about Benedict is that he's underrated as a teacher, because it's true that he was about getting a message across, but I remember being very surprised in a positive way by a video that I saw of him explaining the Eucharist to little children, like who are preparing for First Communion. And you might think that, Pope Benedict, this German theologian and professor and all, would be, it would be impossible for him to speak at their level. And that wasn't the case. He was very, very good with the children and using metaphors that they would understand. And he was a very, very good teacher, right?
Well, let me ask you this. You teach a lot of journalists. And you actually started a seminar that met once a month, a week here, teach people that cover the Vatican.
For the Rome-based Vaticanisti,
yes.
Italians.
When did you start doing that?
Well, it wasn't my idea. It was one of my colleagues.
Okay.
I was involved in it, but it wasn't my own idea. And that was maybe 20 years ago.
And you discovered that that there were certain themes. You mentioned three, I think. I saw in one place that one, their expert knowledge needed improvement. Mm-hmm. And second, I don't remember the second one, but the third one was that maybe the most interesting one is that they couldn't deal with doctrine and morality except in secular terms. And that so consequently they lost something in the translation.
Right.
Can you tell me what did they lose and how could a reporter actually report on doctrine and morality in a way that communicated to the audience but didn't lose what you're talking about?
I mean, there's no question there's a challenge, right, to speak about, say, Catholic moral doctrines in a language that people will understand, right? In today's world, people who are not believers, who aren't versed in moral theology, things like that. And I think one of the things that's important, I think, is to, and it's one of the things we try to do in our classes, is help the students see things from the point of view of the person they're talking to, right? And we have a whole series of classes called media training, where we put them in front of a camera and ask them tough questions. A lot of the time they are moral questions, and they're controversial questions that they have to think. I can't just cite the Bible or quote something that, the people don't accept the authority of the Bible. How am I going to explain this to a person who's not a Roman Catholic believer? And that's, I say, the idea of imagining yourself in the shoes of your listener is a huge part of it. And I also think we have to always go back to the fundamentals of Christian morality, which means you have to go back to Christ himself, basically. And we are created by a loving God, and the plan of God that is for us is a plan, not a bunch of rules that you have to follow, right? But a plan of the Creator who loves us as a father loves his own children, and things like that. And then in that context, you can explain why we want to live this way.
Well, let me put it in a practical sense. Let's say you get a report that there's this guy walking on water, and you want to send a reporter out, and you say, go get the story on the guy walking on water. What would you expect them to come back with? Just the facts, a skepticism, or something more?
Well, I would expect him to come back with, I would say, just the facts, right? As a reporter, right, he would report, I've seen something that I've never seen before, right, which is a fact, right, in itself, and it's an extraordinary fact. But would he conclude that this is God? Not necessarily, right?
Would we report what we're saying and what Jesus would say?
Sure, right.
Factually, just sort of, here's what this wacky guy is saying?
Well, he wouldn't necessarily say he was wacky, right? He would say, this is a guy who's attracting, you have to include, as part of what you're reporting, the effect that he's having on a large crowd of listeners, right? And that he's saying things that are taken seriously. No one has spoke this way before. He's speaking in a new way, with authority that we're not used to listening to, certainly in the Jewish context of our Lord's time. So there's a lot of novelty about the way our Lord speaks and what he's saying, right? And I think that's part of what you would report, right? The novelty, the surprise, the effect, the impact that he's having.
Well, that's two things: entertainment value and the impact. But I wonder if if one shouldn't ask, why should the audience, other than being entertained and that it's being impacted, you need to know about it, would they think about, this is something you need to know about because it could change your life in some way? Or you might change your thinking about life in some way. Not necessarily you change it toward Jesus, but that you would be able to find something from him, what he does, that could be a practical use to anybody or whatever belief.
Yeah. Well, obviously, there's some things about what Jesus has to say which I think would appeal to almost anyone, right? But there's other elements in what Christ is saying that are an enormous challenge, right? And you are put in a corner, I think, by some of the things that Jesus says, right? Which you have to decide: is he a madman? Is he a megalomaniac? Does he think he's God? Right? Which is what the Jewish listeners, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were thought. Wait, he seems to be saying that he's God or the Son of God, right? How can this possibly be? Right? Is he crazy? Is he a liar? Or so then you do have to make a decision, but of course that's up to each person, right?
But the reporter has to make that decision too.
Not necessarily. I don't.
Because why not? Because the reporter's going to say, "I saw this madman loose on the water."
But how would he know he's mad?
Well, I said, I talked to
He's
him.
walking on the water.
How does he know that he's, well, the same thing, the way you would know he's walking on water. You'd look and see, you know, does he look like a madman? Does he act like a madman?
Did he? I don't think he did. He didn't strike people as mad, right? At least not that many people.
Some people.
Some people, yeah.
They thought that was objective.
Well, I don't think the majority of the people didn't think he was a lunatic. That's not the, you know, wasn't the main. Some people did, right? Or some people said that.
Yeah.
But you know, they also the people even who rejected him, right? In Nazareth, there were people who were saying, "Where did he get this wisdom?" Right? And they recognized that what he was saying was substantive and true in some way, and yet it didn't seem possible that he would be the source of this kind of wisdom.
If you put together, when you said, we're going to put together a package on this walking on water guy, what would be your story package?
Well, I don't think I'd have an easy answer to that one. That's a good question. How would you present the man who walks on water? Right? I don't have an answer to that.
Well, how about if you told a reporter, you either get that story, you don't come back.
Well, I know they'd have an easy story to write. Obviously, there's a lot that could be said, right? But I'm not sure how would you frame it. I mean, I think you'd have to frame it as something, a novelty, right?
Well, now you've got different takes on reporting, as you know, today. We had a certain type of objectivity, and then we went through that can't be possible, nobody's subjective. And then the subjectivity out of that came to sort of adversarial or opinion reporting. And now it seems still a mixture of those things. What kind of reporting do you teach at University of the Holy Cross?
We try to aim for objective reporting. I mean, and I think even we're thinking about the Gospels or how we would report Jesus, and you have the case of St. Luke, right at the beginning of St. Luke's Gospel, very famously, where he talks about basically tracking down sources and trying to talk to people who are actually witnesses for this thing. And there's a certain sense in which what St. Luke was doing was reporting.